What does Imbessa give up for being manaless? One of the things she likely gives up is cooldowns. I would assume like being manaless means that your cooldowns, again, could end up being higher. It's another thing. It's like I don't know if give up is the right word for it. It's like what does this character give up for being manaless? Just like I don't know if like what give up when it comes to like characters being mobile is the correct way to say it, right? I think a better way to talk about it is like, what is mana for? Mana is for an attritional resource in lane that gates certain patterns from just going infinite on you. Really easy example of a character who needs to have mana is Ziggs. Ziggs's kit doesn't make sense in a lane in League of Legends if it doesn't have mana, as it stands right now. And if it didn't have mana, his Q would have to probably be twice the cooldown, or way less reliable, or way shorter range, or some combination of that, right? And so a better way is to talk about trade-offs, right? So it's like, one of the reasons Garen has a trade-off is he is a pure melee champion. So one of the reasons it's not super important that Garen has mana costs is because every time Garen interacts with you, he pays a different resource, which is his health bar, in order to do so, which is not something that Ziggs is doing when he's interacting with people. Right? So it's not necessarily like, what does Garen give up to not have mana? It's more like, what gates Garen's patterns in lane? Because that's what it's about. It's like, well, if your pattern isn't gated by eventually forcing you to back because you ran out of mana, right? Then what other ways are there to gate it? So in Garen's case, it's like, we eventually force him to back because he runs out of health. That's what'll happen to Garen, compared to a lot of Ziggs matchups. The Ziggs might not run out of health because he's just standing so far back, and so the mana is the gate on Ziggs in that case. Yasuo, for as frustrating as he can be in lane, like genuinely there's some frustrating things about the guy, right? Yasuo is also another character that like he does have to constantly be in melee range to do things, and he's not going to burst you out in the early game with his spells in the way that like a mage might, or certain other melee champions with mana might. Yasuo's spells, again, tend to be somewhat lower on the output side in the early game for each individual cast. Or in the case of Winwall, has a massive, massive cooldown that you could imagine a version of Yasuo that had mana costs, and Winwall cost 100 mana, and then Winwall might not have to have a really high cooldown because he just casts it 2 times and he goes and that's the thing that would gate him from casting it, as opposed to like making sure it just goes on cooldown when he casts it, right? And then I think the final part of the mana conversation, which is useful to think about, is... I think I'll play another Milio game here. One of the reasons we don't do mana on certain characters is simply just their patterns wouldn't make sense with it. I've talked about this before, but like kind of like the way we tend to do characters is we start them with mana, and then we'll take it away if it doesn't make sense. And so like the default is kind of, most characters should have mana, and then on any given character, is there a reason they shouldn't? And so like, as an example, I had mana on Viego for a while, and one of the main reasons I took it off of him is because A, he's a jungler. We'll start with that. Junglers don't really care about mana to begin with. We just kind of give them infinite mana, unless they're Karthus. But then on top of that, it was like Viego's mana bar started getting really, really hard to track when he was like transforming into 5 different people, right? And so it created a gameplay problem. And so it was like, okay, well, perhaps we should take this off. And then, some of the end results of that in terms of like how the character then would need to be balanced around laning is he probably can't have as much sustain in lane. He probably can't do as much damage with his Q in lane. He probably can't have a super, super low cooldown at level 1 on the E in lane. Things like that. But, again, at the same time... Oh. Emilio. Summon Airy. Let's go. But then, of course, at the same time, it's like... It was pretty important that he didn't have mana because of that. Like, Briar is a character who I also tried to give mana to, and it didn't work. And the reason Briar can't have mana is that she literally kills herself if she runs and that seems to be like kind of like not okay. Like during the test where she had mana, when she cast W, she'd need the E and the Q to be able to control herself in those modes, and then she'd be after she cast W and she just freaking die. And so suddenly I was like, well, the E can't cost mana, and the Q can't cost mana, and at that point I was like, why does she have mana cost at all? So I just switched to health costs and made her spend health to do things instead of mana. Because it turns out Briar, whenever she's casting a spell, she is being attritional in the sense that she's putting her body at risk every time she does it, right? But it was kind of a thing where it's like, I tried giving her mana, and it just made for a really, really, like, somewhat broken pattern that didn't really seem to function. Blitzq mana cost early is an example of true mana gating. Yeah, we use mana cost on Blitzq to gate that champion. It's a very meaningful way to gate that champion, which is actually important because of how incredibly powerful Blitzq is. So there's a reason it costs 100 mana at rank 1, and that's what it's like, well, that's actually a very effective way to gate Blitz, is basically saying, hey, since most of the time you land this spell, they die, you probably should only be able to cast it X number of times. Will we ever get more abilities made for damaging towers? I guess my question is, have those abilities been good for the game, or those characters? So, well, I definitely think it's very cool and, like, thematic that Ziggs can damage towers 100%. I'm not personally convinced that it's made that character, like, balanceable in good ways that are like fun in the long term for Ziggs players. It's kind of like, the question I would ask is like, would Zig players like to kill towers with their W, which by the way is cool, it's definitely cool, or not be as so strongly balanced around the fact that they can just like beat up bot lane and kill its tower really fast, right? It's kind of like a thing, like strategically it's very interesting, and honestly it's got a lot of fun gameplay to it. But it's also like, I wonder if that causes us to have to balance Ziggs in ways that end up being less fun for him in the long run. You hear this a lot from me, but like, it's like, when the game is very tightly balanced around a specific band of win rates, like, you know, between like 50 and like 48 and 52 or whatever, stuff that gives you a lot of power without matching that power and satisfaction becomes potentially dangerous for your character to have. And I worry that Ziggs' tower destruction might be that. Can't speak for everyone, but personally I choose Ziggs to delete towers. Yeah, no, it gives him a very, very clear gameplay identity, that's for sure.